webinar. Yeah, we should be live on all the platforms now. You can start the webinar.
Okay.
Okay. And I'm going
I
to
see
start
some people coming in. You can use the chat, John. Welcome everybody to our webinar. We are just going to be running this pre-roll for a minute. So we want to thank our sponsors and encourage everyone to donate to CPF. We'll be starting right at noon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We are going to be starting at noon. This is the first time that we'll be live streaming on 5 different platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, and LinkedIn. But if you're in the Zoom room, you're going to get a special experience, and we'll be welcoming one of our favorite preservationists, Alan Hess, in just a few moments. If you want, you can use this is Chris French. I forgot to introduce myself again. If you want, you can use the chat window if you're joining us in Zoom to say hi to your friends. If you put your name in the chat, other people can see that you're in the meeting. And we also are broadcasting live on 5 platforms, and you can use the chat windows in those platforms if you'd like to ask Alan a question. Our favorite tech guy and education coordinator, John Haber, is in the background producing all of this content. So it looks like we are welcoming quite a few people. We have 220 people signed up for this webinar today. This is Chris. Hey, Stephen. I saw you posting in the chat. So we have people from 22 states and Canada. We're going to be talking to Alan Hess in just a few minutes. And if you're on joining us with Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, or YouTube, you can also use the chat windows on those platforms to communicate with John, and he will be helping us take questions that we can during our chat with Alan. And we're going to start in just a few minutes. Hi, all. Thanks for joining our webinar. We're going to start in 2 minutes and 20 seconds, according to our countdown clock. And I wanted to say hi to David from Australia. And there's Alan saying hi. We will be starting in 2 minutes. We are live streaming on 5 different platforms today. So if you're joining us from Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, or YouTube, you can use those chat windows to communicate with John Haber, who is in the background. Oh, this is great. And I see somebody's already posted a question to the Q&A on our Zoom. For Alan, what we're going to do is just have a very quick introduction to Alan, and then we'll get into a chat about his 5 books on Frank Lloyd Wright. Oh, I think it's time to start, John. It's 3 o'clock. Let me get everything going here. Hello, Alan. How are you?
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone.
Okay. Hey, John, if everything is looking good, I am going to hit record.
Recording in progress.
All right. Welcome everyone to our second book club with the California Preservation Foundation. And this is a new program that we wanted to start so we can communicate more with everybody out there in the world. We have David from Australia is logged in, and we have a bunch of our friends from California. Alan, we have people from 22 states and Canada joining us today. And Alan is is one of our favorite authors. I'm going to just run through a couple of things before we get started, Alan. We'd like to thank all of the sponsors, the annual sponsors, and WJE, who is our education sponsor, for helping make these programs available free to the public. And also, we do encourage you to visit californiapreservation.org and also to donate or join if you are so inclined. We are producing a lot of great programming all through September, October, November, and into, of course, the holidays of December. And we want you to participate in as much as possible. So now I'd like to introduce Alan Hess, our author for today. Alan is the author of 20 books. He's the architectural critic of the San Jose News. He specializes in preservation and advocacy. Through his writing and presentations, he's worked to preserve works by John Lautner, Oscar Niemeyer, places in Palm Springs, as we know, ranch houses, and of course, Frank Lloyd Wright, who we'll be talking about today. Alan's advocacy ranges from the oldest operating McDonald's, Bullock's Pasadena, and the Hotel Valley Ho in Scottsdale, plus a couple more that we'll talk about, right, Alan? His latest book is Hollywood Modern Houses of the Stars, which was a few years ago, 2018. He also serves on the California State Historical Resources Commission and the boards of Preserve Orange County and Palm Springs Modernism Week. And he's the winner of the President's Award from this organization, CPF, in 1999. And of course, I love to call him the godfather of Googie. Welcome, Alan Hess.
Thanks, Chris. I'm really glad to be part of this new outreach that CPF is doing to spread the word on architecture and preservation.
I can show a couple of these slides, so it's going to just take me one sec. John Haver is here. You all who have been coming, logging into our programs. And I am, of course, Chris Madrid-French. I'm Director of Development and Marketing at CPF. John is in the background helping run all of these live platforms. So I am going to share my screen with Alan's slides on it and get that going. All right, Alan, do you see your Frank Lloyd Wright?
I do, thanks.
Okay, just tell me next when you're ready to go to the next one.
Okay, well, I just wanted to show a couple of slides. I hate people who just talk about architecture and don't show pictures. So these are going to highlight a couple of the points of conversation that Chris and I will be talking about. So yeah, these are 4 of the 5 books I've written about Frank Lloyd Wright, all from Rizzoli. And next. So many different aspects of Wright. I mean, his career and his life is so fascinating, so long, so complex, but still so relevant to today. And so just a couple of ideas which in writing these books, I have come to realize about Frank Lloyd Wright. For example, he didn't know he was Frank Lloyd Wright when he started. He was an experimenter. He went in so many different directions before he kind of settled into the ideas that we today think of as Frank Lloyd Wright. For example, this. He is known for his horizontal prairie houses spread, wide and low on the prairie around Chicago and the Midwest. Well, before he got there, he was doing vertical houses. This is the Martin House in Oak Park, his hometown. But notice how vertical it was. This is a very early building. So he was always an experimenter looking for new ideas. Okay, next one. This is the Willett's house, which is kind of where he ended up finally. Again, low, horizontal, open, sitting on the land. A very different idea, but it's that experiment of trying new things. One of the things that I think makes him important and makes him still relevant to today, because he had, I don't know, at least 5 or 6 different chapters to his career, and he kept on experimenting, pushing into new territory. Next. I'm not seeing the next one yet, Chris. It's still the Willett's house.
Alan, it looks like she lost power.
Oh, she's in Atlanta. Ah, okay. Well, I'll just go on and talk about these points then that I wanted to talk about, and hopefully she'll be back. I don't want to be talking to myself for an hour. Let's see, talking about the horizontality. Another aspect of Wright that I find fascinating is that he was interested in climate design, and that in fact, an argument can be made that architecture responding to climate in a passive way is really what caused him to arrive at what we now call modern architecture: long, low, horizontal lines, bands of windows. And what you would be seeing here is a photograph of the Roby House in Chicago. Hopefully you're familiar with that, or Google it right now. What the Roby House has is broad eaves, which are long and horizontal. So that sense of horizontality came from those eaves. Now, what caused those eaves? Well, the sun in Chicago in the summertime is brutal. I've lived in Chicago, I know. And those wide eaves kept the sunlight out of the interior of the house during the summer. On the other hand, during the winter, when it's brutally cold, those wide eaves allow the sun to come in to the interior of the house, warm the concrete floors, warm the brick walls, and act as passive solar heat sinks. So we can really trace many of the original ideas of modern architecture to a response by Wright to climatological concerns. This is one of my points about Wright, that he's relevant today. There's nothing more important today than climate change for our future. And Wright shows how architecture did, could, and still will respond to those sorts of very practical concerns. Another example of what Wright is all about is the move to the suburbs. He was a contrarian. He never did what everybody else expected him to do in his career. And hopefully there we have Chris back.
Hey, it's a power outage here. Is everything going okay? I completely disappeared. I'm using my phone as the link.
Okay, I just went on and continued to talk about my slides without the benefit of the slides. This is exciting. This is live. Okay. Do you think you can pull up the slides again?
Just get right back into it. I know. Well, I'm going to let everybody need slides because everything that you talk about, we are very familiar with. So hold on one second. I actually have unstable. I want to apologize to everybody, but this is part of live broadcasting. There's always something new and interesting. Apparently I'm recording again. One second, I'll share screen. So I'm actually in Atlanta for a few minutes. So I'm broadcasting from Atlanta.
Okay, I see.
And as you know, I think we stopped right here. As you know, yeah, so you can see the Roby House.
Yeah, and I explained how the wide eaves and the broad bands of windows are a response by Wright to the climate. So modern architecture started with a response to climate in a positive, passive way. Next slide, please. Okay, another thing about modern architecture is that it did not start with the Bauhaus in 1919, which is what the publicists for the Bauhaus have for decades been promoting. In fact, the roots of modern architecture which responds to the modern era, modern technology, modern lifestyles, modern culture can be traced back to Philadelphia after the Civil War. And the gentleman in the upper left-hand corner is Frank Furness, a Philadelphia architect. That's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts directly below him, which may look like a Victorian building, but actually is reflecting the factories of Philadelphia, which were just a few blocks away. Philadelphia was the Silicon Valley of the late 19th century, and Frank Furness was its architect. Working with Frank Furness at that time was a young man named Louis Sullivan, who you see in the lower right-hand corner. Louis Sullivan, of course, went on to help develop the skyscraper, as you see in the picture above him. And of course, working for Louis Sullivan as a young man was Frank Lloyd Wright. So we have this continuity, this tradition of modern architecture responding to modern technology that Wright is a part of. So now the slides have disappeared from my screen once again. And what do we think, John? Are we going to be able to get them back?
Yeah, she got kicked off again, so I'm going to try to pull them up on my screen, even though I've got limited. I have limited real estate here to work with, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let's see. So you probably.
There we are.
Yeah. Give me a second. Okay. You see the screen right now?
I can see it. Yes, thank you. So next slide. There we go. Now, I mentioned that he was a contrarian. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright had a long fallow period from the late teens into the mid 1930s, 20-some years, when he was considered a has-been, old-fashioned, great in Chicago for the Prairie School around 1900, but he hadn't done anything recently. So architecture moved on until 1935, 1936, when he built and opened Falling Water, the house in rural Pennsylvania, and the Johnson Wax Building in Racine, Wisconsin. Suddenly, Wright was back on top of the world. Everybody wanted to publish him, wanted to know about him, asked him to talk. His career was relaunched. And where did he move? Instead of moving to New York, to one of the universities of the East Coast, or even Chicago, he moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, which was in 1936, the middle of nowhere. Now, why would he have done that? This is, again, one of the fascinating things about him. I think it's because he was looking for new territory, new ideas, something to refresh himself. And in the desert, the American Southwest, he saw the materials, the textures, the culture, which was going to inspire the last 2 or 3 decades of his life. There you see him at his office at the bottom, at Taliesin West, his home in Scottsdale, Arizona. Look at the textures of the stone, of concrete, of wood. This was new inspiration for him. Plus, Scottsdale is in the Sun Belt. Now, people didn't realize it at that time, but especially after World War II, the Sun Belt was going to become the new frontier of American culture and society and demographics. The Sun Belt, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Texas, Florida, all of these areas were going to have population moving into them, and they needed architecture. And Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the main influences designing the new architecture for that new part of America, the Sun Belt. Next slide, please. Of course, what he came up with, and he designed this in Arizona, was Broadacre City. This idea of the ideal city, which was spread out, which was horizontal, but with high rises dotted amongst them so that the high rises were not jammed all together as they were in Manhattan, but could stand out as a great tree standing in a meadow and be noticed for its great beauty. He also came up with some interesting transportation systems. You see the helicopters thingy there. It never went into production, I have to admit. But there are other aspects of the broad acre city. If you look down on the ground there, there's some houses, each were built on a 1 acre plot of land. And the reason for that was so that people could grow their own food. Now, again, is that relevant to today? Yes. I mean, more and more, the idea of local food is part of the way people are seeing the city of the future. Frank Lloyd Wright was thinking about that back in the 1930s. Next slide, please, John. Part of that move to the suburb was the automobile and having an architecture which responded to the automobile. On the bottom here, you see his home, his office, Taliesin West in Scottsdale. On the top, you see a California coffee shop by Army & Davis from 1955. This is what is called the Googie style of architecture. It is oriented to the car. It's big, bold, has great signage so that you will see it and notice it as you drive by in the car. This is part of the new architecture of the Sun Belt and the great horizontal cities of Phoenix, Los Angeles, et cetera. But you can see the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright on that Googie architecture. Next slide, please. Another building that he did, this is the Marin County Civic Center, Marin County, California. This was the Capitol building of Broad Acres City. The dome is a library. The one wing is administrative, the other wing is a courthouse. But notice again, it is to be seen from the automobile, to be seen from the highway, and also to fit in with the beautiful natural surroundings and maintain those beautiful natural settings. Next, please. Now, as I mentioned, the Bauhaus has had great PR over the last century, founded in 1919 in Germany. But parallel to the Bauhaus and the international style that it spawned coming out of Europe, there was an entire track of American modern architects related to Frank Lloyd Wright, related to organic architecture. These architects have been kind of forgotten in the process of telling the story of modern architecture. But they're there, their buildings are still there. This is the house that Harwell Hamilton Harris, who was a friend of Frank Lloyd Wright's, that he built in the Hollywood Hills for the Disney artist, Mary Blair. And as you can see, it does relate to the organic ideas of Frank Lloyd Wright in its setting, in its horizontality, and so forth. Harwell Hamilton Harris is only one of a number of architects. John Lautner is another, McKee and Camrath in Texas, Anshin and Allen in San Francisco. I could go on and on, who throughout the 20th century were building organic designs which were quite different from the international style, which kind of took over the glass box skyscrapers of most American cities. Next, please. And I believe this is my last slide. Getting back to Frank Lloyd Wright as a person, his personality, his lifetime, his ups and his downs. The gentleman you see at the top is Louis Sullivan, near the time of his death in 1924. He was, I don't know, in his mid-60s at the time. And life had not been kind to Louis Sullivan, this great American artist and architect. He did not have commissions in his latter part of his life, still very creative, but no chance to express it. He became alcoholic as well. He didn't have money. It was a sad ending to a great American artist's life. But he died in 1924. Frank Lloyd Wright attended his funeral. Richard Neutra attended his funeral. But I wonder what Frank Lloyd Wright was thinking in 1924 when he attended the funeral of the man he called Liebermeister, my master. It could not have been easy because in 1924, Frank Lloyd Wright was not doing that well either. He had hoped that the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo would revive his career. It did not. He didn't have that much work. He was moving to Los Angeles, picked up a couple of house commissions there, but nothing was catching fire. So did Frank Lloyd Wright at Louis Sullivan's funeral see himself ending up the same way? Well, 10, 15 years later, when Frank Lloyd Wright was the same age as Louis Sullivan when he died, Frank Lloyd Wright designed and built Falling Water. And as I mentioned before, this restarted his career. And he had another very successful, very prominent, very well publicized career until he died in 1959. So I think it's interesting to see how these two great artists, Sullivan and Wright, who were so intertwined in their ideas and their work, their lives, they're both different examples of how the life of an American artist can evolve. So that's the end of the slides. So John, do we have our friend Chris back yet?
I'm here.
Oh, good, good.
I'm here. Do you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit, but I can make out what you're saying.
All right, let me close some things and hope that we can work this out. How about now, Alan? Can we go forward?
Yes, let's go forward.
Okay, I had some questions. If everyone wants to put some any questions that you have for Alan, you can post those in the chat window and also the Q&A. And then John will be communicating with me via the chat window. If we can keep the power on here in Atlanta, as you know, Hurricane Ida is going through the south, and it's definitely causing some interruptions as it became a tropical storm. But Alan, I wanted to also, since we are in the book club, you've written 20 books, and I figured if each one is about 200 pages, you've basically written 4,000 pages about architecture. And I wondered if you could maybe share with us some of the approaches that you bring to your work.
Well, when I was in architecture school, I was interested in writing a book, but I did not want to repeat what other people had already done. And there were certain figures like, Richard Neutra. Plenty of people had written really great books on them. So that was off the table. I wanted to introduce something new. At the same time, this is in the 1970s, 1980s, there were a bunch of small, very thin books on vernacular architecture. Daniel Vieira wrote a book called Fill Her Up about gas stations, a subject that I had never read about before. Stephen Eisenhower of Venturi, Scott Brown, was writing a book on White Castle restaurants. Again, a vernacular type of architecture that nobody was paying attention to. Nobody thought they were architecture, let alone important. So I wanted to make a contribution in my books to add, to the information for architects, not just repeat what's been said before. So my first book was on Googie architecture, these roadside, car-oriented, modern buildings in Los Angeles, starting in Los Angeles, spreading across the country in the 50s and 60s. That then, I had a chapter in there on Las Vegas. That led to my second book, Viva Las Vegas, about the history of Las Vegas. Nobody had actually written a history of the hotels and the signs of Las Vegas. So that was my second book. In some way, a lot of my books one has, led to the next. And believe me, there is still a lot of new information about architects, unheralded building types that we really, really need to research and get around to. So I don't want to write them all. I'm inviting our audience today to write some of those books too.
So, so when you wrote the Googie book, and I tease you, Godfather of Googie, it was 1985, I think. Is that when that book came out?
Yes.
Sorry, I have a delay on my end because of the internet. So tell me when did you first discover that Googie was something you should write? You talked about gas stations. Like, when did you realize Googie was going to be your thing at the beginning?
Well, it was in autumn of 1975. I was just starting architecture school, and our professor, John Beach, was taking us on a tour of Los Angeles architecture. I went to UCLA Architecture School, and we went to see Schindler and Neutra, which were tremendous. But as we drove through Silver Lake, he happened to say, "Oh, there's one of those popular modern coffee shops." And we all craned our necks to look at this building as it went by. And it was this strange looking building of triangles and glass, and we all wondered, why in the heck is he pointing that out? That's not like Schindler or Neutra. But it was a Googie coffee shop. And so that launched me into wanting to know more about it, and led to the book. And I'm proud to say that the book has led to a number of those Googie coffee shops being preserved, which is the whole point of California Preservation Foundation. You need to have that information, the documentation, and hopefully a book to show to planning commissioners or city councils and say, this is important. These are valuable books, or these are valuable buildings. So that's why I do it. And that's why I encourage other people to.
Great. We're going to roll into Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'm going to stop my video to try to improve my signal, Alan, but we will both be here. John's going to ask a question from the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay. I will be your Chris fill-in for this one question. I like this question from Gail. Gail's asking, what can young architects today learn from the work and life of Wright that may help them develop their careers?
Well, in a very pragmatic way, Wright was a tremendous self-promoter. He had great ideas, which is important, but then he just kept focused on those ideas, and he promoted them, he talked about them, he advertised them, he included them in his buildings. And so he was a very effective promoter of his own career. That's how he got jobs. His name was famous. So that, I hasten to say, however, that is only one way to have, to get clients and to have an ongoing career. There are others. Nonetheless, Frank Lloyd Wright is an example of how to do that in terms of publicity. In terms of his ideas, which is, I think, most important, he did look at the culture around him with creative, fresh eyes. He saw that the American population was moving to the Sun Belt, to the Southwest. What did that mean? He saw new technology. At the time, it was new technology of automobiles and planes and things of that sort. Today, our new technologies that we're developing are different. Nonetheless, whatever the technology is, it has an effect on today and tomorrow. Be aware of those, work those into your designs. Don't be a slave to the past of what's already been done, but look forward and use your intelligence to figure out, what direction should culture, society, and technology be going. It's a big question, but those are a couple of answers.
And
That's great, Alan. So in the bigger context, is there an actual total for how many? Oh, did I get cut off again, John? I was wondering how many total buildings Frank Lloyd Wright might have completed. Oh, okay.
A number of Wright's buildings. I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue, but I would definitely recommend William Storr's catalogs of Frank Lloyd Wright. He has devoted his career to tracking down unknown Wrights, well-known Wrights, and categorizing them so that we know when and where they were built. And it's a couple hundred actual buildings over his lifetime that were actually built as well. William Storr, Storrer. Look up his books.
I have a question from Susan. It's a longer question about the Freeman House. She's saying, please give us your point of view on the plight of the LA Freeman House for sale by the USC with many sale provisos in place to protect it. Whom do you think should be the ideal buyer for the Freeman House, an individual or a museum?
Yeah, the Storr House in the Freeman House in Los Angeles, one of very few houses Wright did in the 1920s at all. Most of them were built in Los Angeles. Incredibly important building. From the prairie style that he had helped to invent in Chicago, he moved to Los Angeles, brought his ideas about nature, a place, new technology. But because Los Angeles was so different than Chicago, his buildings took a very different form. The Freeman House is one of those. And good clients, yeah, it's on the market today. It has been owned by University of Southern California. It has not been as well maintained as it should. Some of the building technology, concrete blocks, were experimental at the time and they've had problems. So it is a real challenge to take care of a building like this. Who should own it now? This is a much broader question than just the Freeman House. Southern California has one of the world's best collections of modern architecture. But we leave it up to the whims of the real estate market to preserve these buildings. Fortunately, a couple of houses have been bought by very wealthy people who have restored them beautifully. Another of the concrete block houses, the Ennis House, also needed restoration, and a wealthy person came along and bought it. But that's no way to treat your cultural heritage, just to leave it up to chance. The cultural community of Los Angeles, the museums, the schools, the academies, the wealthy donors interested in architecture, should get together and figure out how these incredibly important buildings, these incredibly important models for young architects to understand and to study, to make sure that they survive into the future. I hate to say it, but a number of these really important houses have been torn down already. A number of them are on the market now, and their future is up in the air. I really put forth as a challenge to the cultural community of Los Angeles to come up with some system, some organization that will be able to buy these houses, restore them, and then maintain them into the future, either as private homes or as, for example, as associated with a university or a music school, something which would be for fellows, fellowships where you artists, architects could come and live in the Lovell House, the Freeman House, the Ennis House, whatever, for a period of time. So there are ways to do this, but we have just not treated our famous houses well enough to this point. That's a big, important question.
Question from Eve. Are there plans for Frank Lloyd Wright buildings which have not been built, and could they be built now?
That has been done. The plans, the ownership of the plans of unbuilt Wright houses, those are owned by the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. Most of the original drawings are in New York now, so they are protected. In a couple of cases, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation has sold the rights to build from those plans for several buildings. That can be tricky, though, because without Wright to supervise the construction, with the need to adapt those designs to current building codes, current earthquake codes, current energy codes, et cetera, the question is it really going to be a Wright house or not? It is not. A newly built house is never going to be a real Wright house in the way the Freeman House or the Willett's house or Falling Water are Wright creations. I think it's better really for clients who want a beautiful house to go to current architects, but who understand Wright's ideas. And there's several that are very good at this, and have them design something in the spirit of Frank Lloyd Wright and his ideas, which is brand new. Or buy an old Frank Lloyd Wright house and restore it. That's the other solution if you want a Wright house.
There's a question in the chat that Chris wanted me to ask you, and the question is, can you go into more detail how Frank Lloyd Wright's design, including broad eaves and windows, help with keeping homes cooler in the Southwest? And then can you kind of go into detail as to what constitutes, on that note, what constitutes organic architecture?
Yeah. Organic architecture is a term we use a lot. Frank Lloyd Wright and many of his followers and students and people who are influenced by him. It has multiple meanings, but one is it is conscious of nature and it responds to nature. And the way that the Roby House, as I said earlier, responded to the climate of Chicago is one way that it is organic. It is a living house. It doesn't require mechanical infrastructure to be a pleasant place to live. In that case, it was the mass of the brick in that building. The brick that it was used in the building is at the core of the building, absorbs sunlight in the middle of winter when the sunlight comes in, because it's at a lower angle and it can get past those eaves and get into the center of the house. It warms up those brick pillars and walls. And then at night, that heat is radiated out into the house. So you're using natural solar power to warm the house. I've also written my book, Frank Lloyd Wright, Natural Design, about how that house also has a natural ventilation system as well. Those long bands of windows are French doors, and they open up so that the air can flow through, create ventilation. Also, the lower floor, the basement, which is kind of a family playroom, is on the ground. It's cooler. And there is a central core that takes the cool air from the third floor, circulates it up, or takes the cool air from the first floor, circulates it up to the third floor, which is the master bedroom. So this is all part of design, and Wright thought it through. And so these are some of the ways that passive solar design and interest in how the sun, ventilation, the orientation of your house to the sun as it changes through the year, all of these things can make for better, more energy efficient houses. And those are lessons that can be applied to, brand new houses today, and are being. Now, organic architecture, as I say, has many meanings. Another meaning is that the house is designed conceptually like a tree. You look at a tree, it has roots that are hidden. It has a trunk, which is massive. It has these thin branches. And on the ends of those thin branches, it has leaves. Now, the leaf on that tree looks very different than the root buried underground. And yet they are all part of an organic whole. Wright saw houses in the same way. You might have a lot of different parts of the house. They may look very different, but they are all working together, all responding to the same concept. And so they are organically related to each other. There's a lot else to the question of organic architecture. And as I said, organic architecture was kind of in competition with the international style of architecture through much of the 20th century. The international style was much more mechanical looking, flat roofs, glass and steel facades, more like a machine in the way that they were put together. But we cannot forget that organic architecture, Wright and all of the people that were influenced by him, including the Googie architecture I mentioned, all of that was going on at the same time and is part of our architectural heritage.
Okay, Alan, so we're going to change gears here and ask a question about, we like to be provocative sometimes here at CPF. As you may know, earlier this year during our modernism series, we did a program entitled Where Wright Went Wrong. So this question is on that sort of vein. So the question from Reem is, there are those who criticize Frank Lloyd Wright houses as not strong architecturally, like falling water, the roof isn't properly supported, or his foundations were often too weak. I would love to know what your point of view is on that.
Wright, the myth of Frank Lloyd Wright is that he was a god. Well, I hate to break it to you, but he wasn't. He was a human, which is why I mentioned, for example, his reactions to the death of Louis Sullivan. He was a very human person. And yet he did always fight back against the many, many obstacles that came up throughout his career. As a human story, I find that really, really touching. So even Wright's failures, and he had many, he was overly confident about his understanding of engineering. You mentioned falling water and the problems there with those balconies sagging. The cantilevers were not supported after several, not well supported for decades of existence. And he was so self-confident that he refused to take the advice of his own apprentices or engineers that could have solved those problems. So he was definitely a flawed person. There are, of course, many stories about Frank Lloyd Wright houses leaking in the rain. And those are true. But it is important when we're looking at any artist, but Frank Lloyd Wright in particular, looking at their overall work and their direction and what they did contribute. And Wright, as I said, moving to the Sun Belt, looking at the lifestyle and the materials of the Sun Belt, like few others at that time, he set a direction for the rest of the century for architecture. No one else probably could have done that quite as effectively as he. So that, in my sense, puts him as a very important, very influential architect that we can still learn from today, as I said, because of his interest in, for example, energy conservation.
So, as many of us probably know, Wright also designed a lot of the interior components of the home as well. He was as much a furniture designer and a designer of the building components inside of the building as he was on the outside. And this question from Rena is, can you please talk about how he treated architectural interiors in the buildings that he designed?
Yes. One of his ideas about modern architecture, a break from the past. Victorian houses, which were popular when he started his career, would have rooms that were square boxes, a parlor and a dining room and a study and so forth. And the furniture was mostly manufactured chairs, desks, tables, etc., placed in this box. Wright, as a modernist, thought that those two ideas could be combined, that the shape of the room itself could be altered, designed with practical furniture, furnishings, desks, sofas, etc., bookshelves, and all of the rest, and that they could become one consistent, total, organic design altogether. Go to especially his Usonian houses. These were houses meant to be built by average people of modest size, but to be built by the homeowners themselves. And because the furniture was built in, you didn't have the expense of having to buy furniture. So that was one way in which these modern ideas of how to design interiors were expressive of Wright's modern concepts. And again, one of the ways that Frank Lloyd Wright has been very influential on later architects, built-in furniture of all sorts to create an organic whole.
Now, there's an interesting question about Frank's son, Lloyd Wright, who was also an architect. How close was Frank Lloyd Wright to his son, Lloyd, and how long did Lloyd work with his father?
Lloyd Wright worked with his father from the time Lloyd was a boy at their home in Oak Park and worked in his father's drafting room until Frank Lloyd Wright died in 1959. That does not mean that they had an easy and smooth relationship. It was tempestuous. Both of them were very strong-willed, and that caused a lot of friction. You go to the Frank Lloyd Wright archives, which are at the Getty Research Institute for one place, or any number of books, and you will read the most cutting, dismissive letters from Frank Lloyd Wright to Lloyd Wright, that he wasn't supervising a house well enough, that he made a mistake, that his own work was not really up to snuff. So they had a very tempestuous relationship, and yet they stayed together. They were father and son. I do have to say that Lloyd Wright is one of the most important unheralded architects of Southern California modernism, very definitely. For example, the Oasis Hotel in downtown Palm Springs was designed by Lloyd Wright, opened in 1926, a desert design of poured in place concrete designed for the climate of the desert. And this was before his father had even gone to vacation and live in the desert in Arizona and design his own buildings responding to the desert climate. Lloyd was there first. Lloyd is an incredibly important architect, very creative in so many ways as a modern architect. There's a great book by Alan Weintraub, the photographer, of his work, which I would recommend. He needs to be better known and better appreciated.
So we have a question from Donna, and this sort of dovetails on our last book club program with Ken Bernstein and Stephen Schaefer, who talked about their new book, Preserving Los Angeles. And Donna is asking, how can we bring more broadly architectural preservation consciousness into the forefront of planning in Los Angeles? And how can we support the work of people like Ken and people who work within the city in the preservation realm?
Yeah, this is an ongoing public education effort that everybody who's interested in these preservation issues should keep in mind. Preservation is not just about preserving a beautiful artifact in amber so that it never changes. Preservation is really about planning of a city and making a city more livable, more enjoyable, more economically sound. All of these things, historic preservation, we need to talk about historic preservation as that, not just as, you know, an elitist NIMBY fad or that people will need to enjoy, to appreciate. But preservation is a very practical part of creating livable cities today. Excuse me. For example, one way, and Ken Bernstein talks about this in his book, the old office buildings in downtown Los Angeles, on Broadway and elsewhere, that remained empty for a couple of decades, are now being converted into housing. And they are bringing the downtown center back to life. With housing, you get restaurants, you get stores, you get markets, you get a living community. So in that case, the historic buildings have been used as a way to recreate and revive cities. And there are many other examples. And the book that Ken Bernstein and Schaaf did is a good textbook on how to do that.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the movement of houses, and specifically in the context of organic architecture, like the architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. What are your thoughts? What do you think of moving historical homes in order to preserve them?
It's a last resort. I'd prefer that a building stay on its original site, but it has been done successfully, and it's certainly, moving a building is certainly something that should and can be considered. Of course, you have to realize that the historical context of that house may well have changed entirely around it, even while the house stayed. So a house that was originally in a residential neighborhood may now be in a commercial neighborhood or even an industrial area. So we shouldn't be too precious about keeping a building on its original site just because that's the physical site, even when the context has changed so dramatically.
Okay, and maybe this follows on that question from Stan. He's saying, do you believe that every Wright design structure should be saved simply because it is right, or should they be judged on their own individual merit? And are there any rights that should not be saved?
Every building should be measured on its merits. But I would have to say that you would really have to stretch things to make an argument that a Frank Lloyd Wright house does not measure up in terms of its merits. That would be a really, really hard thing to prove. So in a practical sense, I'd say just about every Frank Lloyd Wright house or building, which still exists, should remain. It has a purpose. It has something to teach us, and just as an artifact, a creation of craftspeople who built it, who did the woodwork, who did the brickwork, whatever. All of that is important information that, for somebody of the stature of Wright, really deserves to be saved.
Okay, and to end today's program, we're going to ask you a subjective question. Which of the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that you're aware of would you consider the most iconic and your favorite?
Well, the most iconic has to be Falling Water, I would say. It has been photographed so many times. It is known across the world. Relatively few people have actually gone to visit it compared to those who know the image of this building above the waterfall. The connection of nature and the human-made habitation. It's a wonderful, wonderful image. So that resonates with people. That idea, that's the organic idea, and that resonates with people, to this day. So that is definitely probably his most famous, best known, and most iconic work representing his. My favorite, impossible to say, of course, but I did have a chance. I lived in Marin County, and I had a chance to be on a jury at the courthouse at the Marin County Civic Center. And I just learned earlier that Chris Madrid French also has been on a jury at that courthouse. And I got to say, sitting in the jury box in this expression of American democracy from this great architect, this great American artist, whose ideas about society and democracy and nature go back through American history, back to Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thomas Jefferson. That all hit me as I was sitting on that jury in that beautiful, beautiful building. So that's certainly one of the most impressive experiences that I have ever had in a Wright building.
Okay, well, thank you, Alan. That was very enlightening, and we had so many questions today that I don't think we were able to cover them all, unfortunately. But we do have an opportunity to send any questions you have specifically of Mr. Hess to his email. So feel free to either put that in the chat box right now, and we'll try to email those to him, or you can email us at cpf@californiapreservation.org. We thank our watchers on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitch. I always thought Twitch was a gaming platform, but now it's a preservation platform. So we're broadcasting to the world here. But thank you, Alan, for being up for this new sort of experiment for CPF. And I pasted into the chat box a link to our feedback form for today, and we really appreciate your support, your time. For those of you who donated, every dollar counts for the protection of historic places. So we do encourage you, we really do encourage you to go to californiapreservation.org/donate and continue to support excellent work like Mr. Hess does and all the other advocates in California. So have a wonderful day. And with that, we're going to close out. Thank you, Mr. Hess.
Good. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye, John. Bye, Chris.
Bye.